you're having a great week so far. Today in Bible class, we are going to be talking about the prophets Micah and Zephaniah. Now, Micah can be summed up with the message true covenant living, and that's referring to living as a people under obedience to God. Okay, Micah prophesied during the years 740 to 700 BC. And if you think about that timeline we've been learning and talking about, the Israelites fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC. So Micah would have been prophesying just before, during, and after the fall of the Israelites. Now his message was to both Israel and Judah. However, he focused on Judah probably because part of the time that he was speaking, Israel had already been destroyed. Now, he makes references to Samaria and to Jerusalem, not to Israel and Judah as much. Samaria was the capital of Israel. You'll need to know these for your quiz. Samaria was the capital of Israel, and Jerusalem was the capital of Judah. Micah himself came from a small town just outside of Jerusalem. So he was a part of Judah. He would have seen what was going on with the Israelites, but he was much more familiar with Judah. Those were his people. And so a lot of his writings focuses heavily on the people of Judah. Micah has several major themes in his messages and writings. The first one is the idea of social justice. And we talked about social justice last week. Social justice is things like feeding the poor, clothing the needy, taking care of widows and orphans, making sure that the court system is fair and right for all people, and making sure that there's no people that are being oppressed or treated different because of their race or their gender or their status. Like making sure all people are equal and being cared for. That's what we call social justice. So he was calling the Israelites out on this, saying, you are treating the poor people, you're robbing the poor, you are not calling fair judgments, you're favoring in favor of the people who are paying you more money, or things like that were happening in Israel's society. And so he was calling them out. He also was calling them out on the idea of true worship. He's saying God doesn't want you to just bring sacrifices and do the routine and that's it. He wants your heart to be purified. He wants you living for him and making sure that whatever you're professing and doing in the temple, that's coming out in your daily life, that you are living a life in service to him. And that's another thing that can apply to us, because God wants faithfulness that results in right living. So we can't just go to church on Sunday and then do what we want the rest of the week. Like our whole lives should reflect obedience to him, that we are God's people. Then the last thing he called them out on was false security. The Israelites had developed this idea that they were God's people, so they could do what they wanted and it didn't matter. We find in chapter 3, verse 11, it says, "Is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us." So they were basically saying, it doesn't matter what we do, we're the Israelites. And that was an idea that was going to cause their destruction and their downfall. We can have that problem too, especially living in a country as blessed as ours. We can think, we're Americans, nothing can happen to us. And as we're seeing right now with this epidemic, like things can happen to us. And we need to put our whole hope and faith in God and just turn to him and know that, whatever his will is, that's what's going to happen. The nations serve him. And just because we are blessed now doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want and we'll continue to be blessed. So that's what Micah was saying to his people. But what we find in Micah is he calls them out on these things, but then he also includes a lament. A lament is what we call like a mourning, a piece of writing that is mourning something. And so he is mourning his country. He's mourning his city and his people because he loves them. So what we see is that Micah, even though he loves the people of Judah, he's still telling them the truth. And so what we can take from that is that we can love our neighbors. We can love the people around us, but we are still obligated to tell them the truth. We are still obligated to tell them the gospel message, to tell them if they're doing things that are going to cause their destruction. Because if we truly love them, we don't want to see those things happen to them. And so Micah was calling the people out on that, but then he was also mourning them because he loved them. He closes a little different than the other books that we have looked at so far. The other books closed with this idea of, okay, a prophecy of God restoring Israel. This is going to happen, judgment is going to happen, but God's going to restore you. Micah is just a little bit different. He has this calling of judgment, and he tells them, you will be judged, and these things are going to happen because of the way you're living. But then he also includes these messianic prophecies. Okay, a messianic prophecy were foretelling things about the future Messiah. And Micah has some of our very famous prophecies that Jesus Christ fulfilled. And the first one is from chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. And he prophesied that there would be a king of peace who would come, and the people would walk with God, and God would walk with the people. And that's kind of cool because Jesus did come to this earth, and he did walk among us. Also, in chapter 5, verse 2, it said that the ultimate king would be born in Bethlehem. And that is kind of a cool one to look at, because even if Jesus was self-proclaimed to be the Messiah, he can't help where he's born. And Bethlehem was a very small town, so not a lot of people really, in the whole scheme of things, were born in Bethlehem. It was an unimportant city. And so the fact that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, something that was completely out of his control, is just one of those things that is a fulfillment of prophecy that only God could do. So really neat there. But back to the closing. So Micah closes then with a prayer. Instead of a foretelling of restoration, he closes with a prayer to God, that God would reveal his power to his people like he did way back with the Israelites in Egypt. That he would draw his people back to him, and that he would forgive his people. And this demonstrated that Micah had hope in God, and he had trust in the character of God. He believed that God could do great things and that God was merciful. And so his last ending is a calling out to God, asking him to do those things for his people. All right, now we're going to take a little break, and we will talk about our next prophet. The next prophet we're looking at is Zephaniah. Zephaniah we're going to title Judgment of the Nations, because even though he was speaking to the people of Judah, he was speaking to the world, to nations in general, because he wanted people to know that God was sovereign and he was over all nations, and that one day all nations would serve him. So that's what we're going to title this one. People believe, based on the content we find in Zephaniah, that his ministry dated somewhere between 640 and 612 BC. He mentions that he was living during the reign of King Josiah, okay? King Josiah. And we find that in the book of 2 Kings, chapters 22 and 23, King Josiah found some old scrolls of the book of the law. And when he read those, he realized that his people had been straying very far from what God had originally commanded the people. And he ordered that all people assemble and that the book of the law be read, and then that they were all to just lament and cry out for their sin and to begin living according to the book of the law again. So many people believe that this probably was after Zephaniah's messages, because Zephaniah is telling them that judgment is coming because of their evil living. So more than likely, the book of the law was found after that, and the reform that was going on in the nation was after that. We know that based on these dates, this was after the fall of Israel to the Assyrians. So Judah is it now. Judah is the only nation of God's people that is left. We also know that it is before the Babylonians come into their nation. So before anything happens. And it is also mentioned that it is after the fall of Nineveh. That's where they get this last date here, because in some of the other books that we actually aren't going to have time to look at, like the book of Nahum, it talks about Nineveh's fall, and that happened in 612. And so they're able to then kind of frame Zephaniah's ministry into that time period because of these other dates that are referenced throughout. So I think that's kind of cool, the way history and archaeology and things like that can help us out with dating the Bible and placing it in a way that we can understand it. Okay, so Zephaniah has two major themes. The first one is judgment. Zephaniah calls out judgment on the people of Judah. They had begun Baal worship, Moloch worship, and we also find this what we would call today agnosticism. Okay, and agnostics believe there is a God, they just don't really care or think that God has anything to do with them. If we look in Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 12, it says, "The Lord will do nothing, either good or bad." So they believed that there was the Lord, however, they didn't think that he was really involved with them. So we have this total just turn from God, whether it's a turn to false gods or just a turn to not caring. Zephaniah also pronounces judgment against the nations, and he calls out specific nations that are around them. But he says that all nations are going to fall because of their evil if they do not turn to God. And he uses this phrase called the day of wrath. And that is the day when God is going to come and he's going to judge all the nations. And he's saying everyone is going to be held accountable for whether or not they follow God, not just the Israelites. The second part of Zephaniah's message, though, is a message of hope. And it's hope not just for the Israelites, but hope for the nations. He talks about God bringing healing to creation and healing to the people. And he talks about him restoring them to their promised places, restoring them to a right relationship with him. And it talks about him giving them blessings and him rejoicing over them. Not the people rejoicing over God, but God rejoicing over his people because he loves them so much and they're finally serving him and following him. And it talks about blessings for all nations, which is unbelievable because God made his promises to Israel, but he extended that through Jesus Christ for us. And so we will one day get all of those blessings of heaven and blessings of a restored world and restored relationship with God through what Jesus Christ did on the cross. And so Zephaniah encourages us and tells us that this should be motivation to live lives that are pleasing to God. It should be a life of gratitude, knowing that God's going to restore us, God's going to make this perfect place and shower us with blessings, should prompt us to live lives following him, worshiping him, and pleasing to him. So, both Micah and Zephaniah have messages that were for the people, and they were pronouncing judgment for the people that was to come. But it's also messages that applies to us today. And so I think like a lot of times we read the prophets and we think, oh, there's just a lot of big words and it's about kingdoms falling and nations falling. And sometimes we really don't quite apply that to us. But if we can dissect it down and see what God was saying through his prophets and why he was saying that, then we can find that the prophets have a lot that applies to us also. So those are our 2 prophets for this week. We'll have a few more. I don't think that we're going to be able to get all the way through them because of the shortening of the year a little bit, but we'll get through as many as we can, and we will just be able to gain that encouragement from them. And if you guys have any questions on any of this, or if you have thoughts or comments, I would love to hear them. Just send me a message or put them on the post so that everybody can get involved in the discussion. But you guys will have your quiz tomorrow, and I just hope you guys have an awesome week. I'll talk to you later.